Welcome to the Big World Made Small podcast for the adventure traveler. I'm thrilled you're here. My name is Jason Elkins, and in addition to being your host, I'm also a former U.S. Army paratrooper, third-generation commercial hot air balloon pilot, paramotor pilot, ex-Montana fly fishing guide, advanced open water scuba diver, and a full-time nomad that's visited more than 30 countries on 6 continents. As a seasoned adventure travel expert with a passion for creating and sharing meaningful experiences, I'm on a quest to impact the lives of adventure travelers, tour operators they rely on, and the communities that host them. Every week, I bring you exclusive interviews with fascinating adventure tourism experts who have agreed to share their personal stories, favorite destinations, and some invaluable travel insights they've picked up along the way. We'll enjoy a casual conversation, create some connections, and likely share some laughs. It's my hope that by the end of each episode, this big world will feel just a bit smaller. Let's get started, shall we? Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Big World Made Small podcast for the adventure traveler. Very excited today. We've got Marc Leaderman here. He is the product and operations director for Wild Frontiers Adventure Travel. Marc, so happy to have you here. Did I pronounce everything right?
You did. Very well done. Hi, Jason. Nice to be here.
Good to have you. We spoke a few weeks ago and had an interesting conversation, and I just thought it would be great for our listeners to come back and actually push the record button this time. So appreciate you doing that. And before we get into the business and kind of what you do on a daily basis, I'd really want to learn more about you, because I think that's kind of what our podcast is all about. I think we have interesting people on the show and love to kind of hear a little bit about your story. How did you get from wherever you were to where you are now? And we can go back as far as you want to go. So how far should we go?
I'm going to go back quite a long way, because I think my background is probably quite different from a lot of the people that find themselves within the travel industry. A lot of people that I meet, they tell me amazing stories about how they'd go camping with their parents, through Africa when they were kids, or they would travel all over the place, and that's where they got the travel bug from. I never had any of that. And partly that's because my mum controlled the purse strings in our house. And my mum's father died when my mum was a young girl, leaving my mum alone with 2 sisters and her mum. And back in the day, with no male wage earner, holidays were literally the last thing on anyone's mind. So my mum grew up with that mentality of not having a holiday. So when she got married to my dad, he controlled the purse strings. Holidays were just not something that were ever considered. And we did literally one foreign holiday in my entire childhood. And that was a 2-week package holiday to Mallorca in Spain. It was nothing. I don't have these stories from childhood that I can go back to. And travel really wasn't a part in any way of my childhood. We did, even in the UK, we did a week in Cornwall in a cabin that someone had lent to my dad. We did a holiday for a week on the Isle of Wight, but there was nothing really exciting in there.
I'm curious, Marc.
Yeah.
I'm curious. What did your father bring into that relationship? Was he raised with vacations and travel? Did that all come to an end when he met your mom, or what kind of background did he bring to the table?
Not really. I mean, my parents are both either the children or grandchildren of immigrants to the UK. Okay. So I just think neither of them grew up either in a family or in a community where going on a holiday was something that was seen as anything other than incredibly self-indulgent and for others. And I think it was the occasional day trip to the coast. That was about the extent of it. So I think that contrasts perhaps, obviously, Jason, you've spoken with a lot of people who've worked in travel, but I don't know whether that conflicts a little bit with their background.
No, I think you're right. A lot of folks were exposed to it early on, somebody in their life, whether it was their parents, or I've had quite a few guests that mentioned actually grandparents or aunts and uncles that had traveled and sent back postcards. And although they weren't able to travel, they got inspired by someone else that was doing it, or National Geographic magazines. I can tell you that was a big one for me. My mom had the foresight to buy like a full year's worth of National Geographics for the year I was born. So as I got older as a kid, we always had National Geographics around, and I'd flip through them and I'd pull out the maps and post them up on the bedroom walls. And that was all before I had a chance to actually go anywhere. So I think there's a lot of different things that can inspire us. And I'm curious. So without traveling a lot and without going camping or doing some of those activities, if you were to reflect back on your childhood, was there something going on that was kind of maybe analogous to travel or adventure that got you inspired? Or do you remember anything from your childhood?
Nothing as intellectual as National Geographic, if I'm honest. And this is growing up in the 80s. It was probably Bond films.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
I mean, for me as a kid, I remember seeing, Bond in Egypt, Bond in Venezuela, Bond in, Hong Kong. And that, for me, I think was probably my first exposure to another world. But no, I was quite an academic kid. So I was big into my studies. Chess was one of the things that I was big into. I mean, literally, people that knew me when I was a kid sometimes find it amazing when they look at my career today and some of the travel that I've done. And when I look back and I compare it, it is quite different. And I think that was part of it, that when it was a big thing when I got into the late 80s, early 90s, one of the things that was really, really big in the UK was taking a break between between school and university.
The gap year, right?
Yeah, the gap year.
Yep.
And I realized that I was very good academically. I had a guaranteed university place to go to, but I knew that I lacked a little bit of life experience, and I knew that I needed to push myself outside of my boundaries. And that for me is, I think, where it started. And the first trip that I did, and I was not a sporty kid at all. And some of my friends were doing a skiing trip, and they asked me if I wanted to go. And I said, skiing? Me? I said, I've never been skiing in my life. You've been skiing since you were kids. I'm not going to be able to ski. And they encouraged me to go. I went along, and on day one of the ski, I got put in a beginner's class. As expected, I was the worst person in the class. Day two, I was the worst person in the class, to the extent that I was being taken up on the drag lift. One of my skis fell off. Someone had to pick it up from behind me. It was just a nightmare. But by the end of the week, and it was just a 5-day course, I graduated top of my class. It was ridiculous. Wow. It was a beginner's class. It means nothing. I'm not going to be competing in anything anytime soon. But it was such a revelation for me. And it seems so naive now to think back to it. But I suddenly said to myself, in just 1 week, I can go from being absolutely rubbish at something to actually being okay. And the world almost suddenly opened up to me, where I suddenly thought, oh my God, how many other things am I absolutely rubbish at that maybe with a little bit of effort, I could actually be quite good at and enjoy. And I think that revelation, which some people probably have when they're kids, some people never have. I reached that age probably when I was about 18 or 19. That's when that revelation happened to me. And suddenly the world became a much more exciting place. And so
I wish everybody could have that experience. I think of my kids, and I have the conversation. My son is 17, and I have that conversation with him. He's like, well, I can't do this. I'm not good at it. Well, you've never tried. And I would love to take what you just shared, and I'm going to make sure he hears this episode, because I think that's and useful.
There's loads of things on LinkedIn from inspirational people saying, your first podcast will be rubbish. Your first webinar will be rubbish. Your first anything will be rubbish. Yeah. If you're not prepared to go through that, you'll never get through the stages. And I never felt that, because I think academia had come quite easy to me. I'd always been quite good at the stuff that I did, and I just did more of that. So choosing to do more things that I was rubbish at, I think encouraged me to give things a try. And I suppose within that context, my first, real travel experience that I would put down, the one which I think set me off on the track that I'm now on, was during my second year at university, where we got given the opportunity to do a teaching exchange in the summer with Romania. Now, this was Romania in 1993. Mm-hmm. This was just 4 years after the fall of communism, after Ceausescu had fled the country. I knew nothing. And obviously this is before the days of the internet. I had no idea to be honest, I barely knew where Romania was on a map. But in my new mentality of, I'll give that a go. I don't know what I'm going to be like. Let's go teach English in the summer in Romania. And that experience opened my eyes to just a whole nother world. I think things which really stood out for me, they called it aggressive Romanian hospitality. And it was incredible. That at the end of my first class, and they said, you're nothing special, this is normal. There was a line of students waiting to demand that I came to their house for dinner. It was just, it was just the way that it was done. And it was great. And I'd never experienced this before. But one of the stories that really stuck with me and really sticks with me to this day was one of my students, a girl called Wana. She'd invited me for dinner at her mum's house. And we were walking from the university across the main square to where she lived on the other side of town. And she was a very chatty 16, 17-year-old girl, everything going fine. And as we crossed the main square, she suddenly fell silent. We crossed the main square and I said, is everything okay? She was, yeah, it's fine. I'm fine. I'll tell you later. We got to her mum's house and we started to talk more. And I said to her, why did you fall quiet when we crossed the square? And she took a deep breath and she picked up a picture showing herself, her mother, and a guy who was her older brother. And she said, back in 1989, 4 years earlier, she said, my brother had gone to the square. She said, all of us did. She said, we were, shouting for peace and chanting slogans. And she said, the local police opened fire and my brother was shot dead next to me.
Oh, wow.
And we then carried on with the dinner, and it was obviously just a part of her life. But I looked at this girl, I looked at this guy, and I thought, this is not some story from a bygone era. These are people who are within 2 or 3 years of my age, and their upbringing and their life experiences are just so different. And I felt embarrassed that I'd never really given it a moment's thought. And I remember her telling me that she'd actually traveled to the UK as part of an orchestral group. And she'd gone into a supermarket, a Tesco, local supermarket, and her mouth had just dropped open at the variety of things on display. And she took out her little disposable camera because she wanted to take a photograph to show her mother back home. And she decided not to. And she said, I can't show my mother and my friends what there is here. I'd never thought about that. And it was only when I came back and I looked around a supermarket, which for me was as banal as anything, but seeing it through her eyes, having seen what life was like in Romania, where there was nothing. I mean, literally pickled vegetables was about, and this is after communism, nothing available. You'd go to a restaurant and the only thing available was cheese or a tomato. That was the entire thing on offer. And I really was forced to, relook at my life, everything that I'd just taken for granted. And I wanted to know more. And that's really where, for me, it all started from that experience in Romania.
What a great story. Sad.
Yeah.
And profound. And that really kind of helps explain. You mentioned your story is a little different than other people. And but that is something that I think that many of us that work in this business can really relate to. I know anybody listening to this that has traveled outside the country, especially to places where there's been recent conflict or serious financial limitations. It's I've spent most of the last 2.5 years traveling, most of that in Colombia, and sometimes I get that almost embarrassed thing. Yeah, it's like, I'm not going to pull out my phone and show pictures of, look what we have back in the US. Look what our grocery stores are like. And I get that. I can. And of course, in Colombia, not too long ago, they had a lot of conflict. And, I've met quite a few people that lost
especially
parents.
Where you are in Medellin.
Yeah. Yeah. I lived in Comuna 13 for the last 5 or 6 months. And that's a community where you can find bullet holes in walls still. Yeah. And, and there's people there that lost brothers and sisters. And it's a profound thing that comes up when you travel to places like that.
And it's fine. I mean, I'm not asking, we all have our troubles and they may be first world troubles, but they are what they are, and we all have our issues, and you can't always say, but yes, think of a villager in Somalia and your life compared to them is so much better. You can't do that the whole time. You have to deal with your issues. But I think just occasionally taking a step back and putting your life into perspective of people that you've met, that purely for the chance and the luck of where you were born and when you were born completely defines your entire existence. And obviously none of us know what we would be like had we been born in a different time, in a different place. That's just the eternal question. We'll never know.
And I also find it interesting though, that when I'm in places that, frankly, I meet a lot of people that would love to have the opportunity to travel to the US, to live in the US, to be in the US or the UK or Dubai or Switzerland. I hear Switzerland a lot. That's a popular one. And frankly, sometimes I think, well, but I love it here. That's like, why would you want to go there? I almost brag that I'm almost Colombian now because I love it, but I can also realize that their challenges and their struggles and their lives are different, number one. But number two, the thing that I really wanted to touch on was how incredibly happy some people are. When we visit these places, and I haven't been to Romania, especially 4 years after the fall of communism.
Yep.
But I have been to Cuba. I've been to a few places, even Colombia, where I'm shocked at how just the energy and the passion that people have for life, regardless. In Africa, the African people, there's many places in Africa that are financially not that well off, but boy, those little kids just smile bigger than you can imagine.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting, juxtaposition sometimes when you look at, a community and there's obviously some real challenges and struggles, but then you think, man, people here seem so much happier than they do back in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, some of these places, or maybe London.
I think it's right. And I think obviously there's the danger of seeing things through rose-tinted glasses, but I think You're absolutely right. That does exist. And I think a lot of it maybe has to do with expectation of life. And I don't know whether, in the West, we're almost set no limits. And so we're always going to underachieve what we are told we could achieve. And as a consequence, we're miserable rather than, even just going back to my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation, I just think they had lower expectations from their life. So it was easier, sales targets. You set a low sales target and you get your sales target, you're happy. You work for a really competitive, ambitious company and they set high sales targets. You may end up getting more sales and more commission and all of that stuff, but you'll probably feel less satisfied because you're never attaining those very aggressive sales targets. And I don't know, and that's not Wild Frontiers at all, but I don't know whether or not it's that analogy that kind of helps explain a little bit why there are so many dissatisfied people in the West compared to, as you say, people you go through communities who have a fraction of what we have in many cases.
When you mention the expectations thing, I have to go back to the story you just shared about the young lady in Romania who didn't want to take a photo of the grocery store in the UK and share that with her mom. And that's very clearly, it's like, well, I don't want my mom to feel sad that she can't have this. It's like and with the proliferation of, obviously television, the internet, everybody has a phone now, even in the most impoverished communities, they have phones, they have access to everything on the internet. They have access to Instagram. So they see all these people that are traveling around and doing these things or dressed exotically or whatever. And you almost kind of wonder what that might do to the happiness of just people in general. Because I think even Americans, I say Americans, Brits, first world. I'm still not sure how to use the terminology correctly, but we're constantly judging and comparing ourselves to others and feeling like, well, I can never hit that goal. So, but it's touching on exactly what you were just saying.
Agreed.
What's the solution?
that I don't know. But all I can say, just going back to my story, that set me off on a path, and that put me in a bit of a dilemma because I'd gone to a good university and I'd studied classics. I'd done Latin and Greek and philosophy. Why? Because I was always said, I'm going to be a lawyer. And I was told in the UK to be a lawyer, you can do any degree, do it at a good university, and then you just do a 1-year catch-up course in your professional studies, and then you can go on to do law. So that was always my plan. When I came back from Romania, I suddenly realized I didn't want to be a lawyer anymore. And then I asked myself, what am I doing in the middle of a classics degree? And there was always a joke for classics students. They say, what do you say to a classics graduate? Can I have fries with that, please?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's not the most vocation.
But as long as you have this, well, I want to be a lawyer, then it's okay. Then exactly. That makes sense. But if I don't want to be a lawyer, I get it.
Yeah, it's not the most vocational degree. So I had a little bit of a panic attack when I remember after graduating, all my friends were going off. They were joining big law firms. They were, being caught up. They knew what they were doing. I had no idea, but I knew what I didn't want to do. And I knew what I wanted to do had something to do with pushing my boundaries and travel. And I ended up learning how to teach English properly as a foreign language. And I ended up going to Japan for a year. And then from Japan, Brits have got a working holiday arrangement with Australia, and I've got some family in Australia. So I then went to Australia for a year. And when I was in Australia,
to teach them English as well.
Well, you could, and it was something I considered. But this is where I had to make choices, because a lot of the people that I did meet there, Brits, they were teaching English, but they'd have to be in one of the big cities. They'd be in Sydney, they'd be in Melbourne, and that was their existence. Or what they were doing is people were picking fruit, up along the Gold Coast, the east coast of Australia, and that was mainly what Brits did when they went to Australia for a year. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to do either of those things. And I knew I needed to do something different. And I found myself a bizarre job, but I ended up finding myself a job, which was a door-to-door salesman traveling around the country with a group of people selling educational products for kids. And it was amazing. We just were given a little bit of money. We got given some products and we got told, off you go. And we were going to remote mining communities who were actually really keen to meet us because they're stuck in the middle of nowhere. And again, this is before the days of the internet. People didn't have access to educational products and games and all of these things. So I ended up doing that for 8 months. And I think what that taught me, and it is something which I think has helped me throughout my professional career, is they told us some very simple stats. They said, okay, this is how it works. You're going to start off early afternoon and you're going to knock on houses and you're going to ask people if they're interested in, seeing some educational stuff. They said, on average, you're going to knock on about 130 doors every day. Out of those 130, approximately 10 will actually want to see the stuff that you're selling. Out of those 10, 3 will actually invite you in to learn a little bit more. And out of the 3 people that see it, 1 will buy.
Yeah.
And that's fine. You make 1 sell a day, you're doing fine. That meant that I had to hear the word no on average 129 times a day and still feel like I was doing a good job. And that really screwed with my head. That was hard, and that is hard. And it's something when I've been working with my sales team at various stages to understand that there is this mentality that another no means you're closer to your next yes, and that you can't give up hope. And when you're knocking on a door, hoping to go inside, and this is maybe more of an American attitude than a British attitude, you have to believe that you're going to get inside. If you've got this approach, this mentality that's like, ugh, what's the point? I've already heard 25 people say to me no. So that was quite, again, just a very different experience. But it was that job that gave me the confidence when I came back to the UK, having been away for 2 years, to go and apply to be a tour leader. To go out to a country that I'd never been to before, to get given maybe 1 or 2 weeks in advance, and then to be out in Turkey, Jordan, China, India, Pakistan, Mongolia, wherever, and to know you're going to be okay, you're going to handle it. It was that job probably more than anything else that gave me the confidence to go and do that.
I love it. No, that makes so much sense. I was actually just speaking with somebody about the power of the word no in a slightly different context, but I did real estate sales. I knocked on a lot of doors. And we used to, I'd have coaches that would say, okay, every time you hear a no, imagine you're putting money in your pocket, right? Because you got to get, and then eventually when you get the yes, then you can take the money out of your pocket and put it in your bank account or whatever. There's definitely a lot of mindset things around asking for things that you sometimes don't feel like you deserve. You don't, you've got your own stories. And I can imagine somebody doing some other type of work in Australia, maybe picking fruit, and then deciding, ooh, there's a job to be a tour guide in all these countries, but who am I to ask? And you're like, I just heard no 129 times a day.
Yeah.
So I don't mind. I'll ask. And so yeah, I can see the connection. Yeah, that's very cool. So then, you got this job leading trips.
Yeah. So this was for the company Explore Worldwide. Mm-hmm. And this was, in a way, I think it was a golden era, because this was a time when they were in desperate need for tour leaders, Western tour leaders, let's call them Western tour leaders, because at the time, in a lot of the countries in which we were operating, there wasn't the experience for local tour leaders. There would be local guides in some places. Mm-hmm. Some Explore trips, I was told, no, you're going to be doing all the guiding. So that was a challenge as well. But in general, no, you would go away, but you'd go away for 6 months. And that was one of the things you had to commit to, be going away for 6 months at a time. And that was it. And again, before the days of the internet, before the days of mobile phones, I mean, it's not that long ago, but I remember phone cards and having to go to banks to collect additional money with travelers' checks and all of these things, which I'm telling people today, and they're looking at me literally like I'm talking about the Victorian era. It's like, it really wasn't. This was the late 90s going into the early 2000s, but it was the way in which it was done. And there was something quite magical about having to let go everything that you know, and you would have to embrace the new country that you were in. You couldn't be checking in on your friends and family every 5 minutes, liking posts and WhatsApp messages. You were out there, and yeah, you may get the occasional letter. Occasionally, as time developed, I remember, queuing to go into an internet cafe where there was the slowest connection speed ever. And if you were lucky, you may be able to get one message out to one member. But again, that would be something that you would do maybe every 2 or 3 weeks. It really was a different era. And part of me misses that. And part of me misses not knowing what the next place is going to look like, and having clients that don't know how amazing the next place that you're going to look at, rather than saying, oh, are we going to see that view that I've
the
seen
Instagram photo
on Instagram or whatever. Yeah. And obviously, look, we have to adapt. And, there are huge advantages now to the world in which we live in. But for me, I think that was a little bit of a golden era. And when I speak to, I think, other tour leaders or other people who led at that time or immediately before, there is a little bit of old school mentality about it where we don't need our hand held. I remember being told for my first trip, which was 6 months in Eastern Turkey, they gave me the notes. They gave me, the contract. They said, 2 days before every trip, you'll get given a fax will get sent to your hotel, and they'll tell you who your clients are going to be. They said, right, this is our 24-hour emergency number, but we don't want to hear from you. Just get on with it. And that was the mentality. And there really was something liberating in that, which is just get on with the job. And I think that came not just from me as a tour leader, but there was also, I think, an element of that from the clients that I was traveling with, that they were there. They weren't constantly referring back to what was going on in the world, in the news. They were away, having a break and embracing whatever destination it was. Obviously, for me, it was Eastern Turkey for my first.
They're not Googling the next destination, the next place they're going. They're not
TripAdvisor to check, the rating.
Make sure the reviews for the hotel you're staying at are good enough. Yeah. I get that. I was leading trips back in the day as well, and I remember I lived in Vermont, very rural Vermont. Cell phones didn't really work that well there. Never really felt like I needed a cell phone. At the time, I was leading a trip in Chile, didn't have a cell phone. There was an earthquake. All of a sudden, the need to have a cell phone arose. And that's when, from then on, I had a cell phone when I was leading trips. But we still figured it out. I still found all the clients without a cell phone and without the regular phone system. We got them all together. We went and had a nice time. But yeah, it was nice to just kind of disconnect and really be present with your clients. And it's nice for them because, hopefully they're not all running around on their phones the whole time. Yeah. And we just see it. You go to a restaurant any day this week, you go to a restaurant, half the people in there are on their cell phone, or people traveling. I'm on the metro line here. Everybody's on their cell phone for the entire trip. And yeah, it's changed a bit.
And I think also as a leader, it forced me and anyone leading at that time to be much more organized than you need to be today. You can't leave everything to the last minute. Oh, I'll book the restaurant while I'm en route, or I'll do this. No, you sometimes had to think 3-4 days in advance and make sure that everything was organized and planned. Where am I going to be able to make a call from? Some of the leaders that we work with now who are brand new and complain about certain things, there is an element, and I do feel like, oh my God, I feel like one of these kind of old timers, but there is an element of, you realize how easy it is these days.
GPS? What is that all about?
I remember navigating on, God, you just reminded me on, I think it was my 3rd trip to Eastern Turkey. At the time, you had to have in Turkey what was called a silent guide, which was, even though I was okay being a UK tour leader, but in Turkey, in the East, you needed to have a Turkish approved guide with you. But at the time, none of the Turkish guides wanted to go to Eastern Turkey. Why? Because it wasn't as much fun as Western Turkey, which was where all the parties were. It was where all the the Westerners were going to the beach, this is a reality. There wasn't any shopping be done, which was one of the perks for the local guides. So the only way that the company would deal with it is every trip that I did, I would get a different guide that would sit there with me. They didn't do anything, but they just sat there because they had to. And I remember some of the Turkish guides freaking out about being in Eastern Turkey because it was just so different from their world. But one of them had left us and we were coming back to Ankara to get an overnight train to Istanbul. And the driver had never been to Ankara before. And we're running late because we'd had a puncture en route. And I'm looking at my watch and we're going to miss the train. They need to get there. And I'm using the map from the Lonely Planet guide to navigate our way through the streets of Ankara. No GPS, that's kind of why you just reminded me. Driver had no idea where he was going, and I'm literally using this tiny little map, which is not designed for navigating a bus through the streets of Ankara, but I'm using, thank you, Lonely Planet, eventually for navigating. We did go down a street, one-way street the wrong way, but we eventually got to the train station 5 minutes before the train left, and I got my entire group on board, so that was a little success story. But yes, I do remember those stressful days before the days of GPS and other lovely things.
And so I can imagine you dealing with the newer guides and all this, and they're like, well, all these problems and all these challenges. And I'm like, you have Google Maps on your phone. You can find it. You can WhatsApp is huge. We've got so many tools right now that make it seem like it'd be easier. But at the same time, a lot of those tools, as we were discussing, can kind of pull you out of being that present.
Yep.
With your clients. Cause it's like, I can imagine, I'm a father, I've got kids, and I'm not saying that tour guides are like parents, but there's some analogies. And when I'm with my kids and I should be spending time with them and being present with them, and I'm on my phone, thinking about what I'm going to do tomorrow or thinking about work or this or that or whatever, I can't really be present with them. It's kind of the same thing. I can envision a tour guide, with a group worrying about where they're going next and on their phone constantly the entire time and driving past some amazing things that are those opportunities that you and I used to have, like, oh, wait, look what's going on over here. We're going to stop the van here. It's not on the agenda. It's not on the itinerary, but we're going to stop the van and we're going to go look at whatever street market thing is going on over here. There's a trade-off. And then, I've with several folks having the conversations about just that Instagram thing where it's, people think they need to go there. They need to see this particular thing. And you as a tour operator, realize that there's so many better things, and trying to cater to their desire to see, let's say, Pisa or whatever.
Yep.
Their desire to see Pisa because their friends all showed them pictures of Pisa and it's all over, Instagram or whatever. But everything else about what they're telling you they want is like, it's in direct conflict. So how do you work with your sales team and your product ads and product development? How do you find that balance?
This is really hard because I think you're absolutely right. Often what people think is going to be the highlight of their trip rarely is. People think, they go to India, they think going to the Taj Mahal, which is an incredible experience. But when we ask people what were the highlights of your trip, no one writes the Taj Mahal. I mean, no one writes the Taj Mahal. They enjoy it, but it's the experience that they have in the back road, staying in the rural palace. It is the eating the street food on the corner. But I have to balance that. And obviously this is one of my jobs with what are people going to buy? Again, I've designed trips that have been nominated for awards and haven't sold a single place.
Yeah. I get it.
And I have to balance that with the fact, and I think I grew up a lot with the challenges, and I'm jumping around a little bit, with the challenges that COVID faced, having to say, I can't just have a bunch of self-indulgent trips, which are great and which people that really know are happy to buy, because I need to provide jobs. I now feel responsible for the people that are employed here. So it is finding that balance. And there is also the element of, not everyone wants the same thing. And you can find a balance. And I think probably that's the way I go about it now, that I'm going to take you to the Taj Mahal. If I were organizing a trip in Italy, I'd take you to Pisa. But one, I'll see if there's a way in which I can do it differently. Maybe I'll take you there at a time of day that is not considered the optimum time to go, and as a consequence, you'll have a much nicer experience. Or I'll organize it in the off season, or in addition, I'll take you somewhere else. And maybe with time, you'll start to trust me when I start not to include those highlights in trips. And that is really, it's the balance. And the world of travel is constantly changing. At the moment for us, Albania is a really good example of a destination which a few years ago, few people would have really considered. At the moment, it's absolutely booming, and it's great. And I was out there last year doing some guide training with some of our Albanian kind of leaders and guides that we have out there. And I was blown away by the history. It reminded me, there were elements that reminded me of Romania with its link with communism in recent past, the mountains and everything. I mean, it's a beautiful country, but we have to keep an eye on it, because in 2-3 years' time, places where, we were able, or at the moment now able, to give people those really special experiences suddenly find themselves potentially within 2 or 3 hours from a cruise ship docking station. And before you know it, we have to move on. So that's what keeps, I think, the world of travel exciting, constantly having to pivot, I suppose is the word of the day, to keep things fresh.
Do you think that the new destinations get, I don't know if overrun is the right word, but over tourism? Did they get to that point of over tourism much quicker because of technology and social media? I can just imagine it just happens so much faster.
Yeah, I really think so. And I think there are additional pressures that happen as a consequence. We saw it in Georgia in 2019, and we saw it a little bit in Albania last year, where there is such a spike in interest that suddenly there's not enough capacity in hotels. There's not enough capacity in restaurants. There's not enough good guides available. And there reaches a critical point where we've actually got to the stages where we stop selling that destination for that year. We're like, we can't. And we've had these discussions with our partners to say, I know you want the business, and maybe you in Albania, you haven't had business like this ever, but you need to tell us when you can't provide the level of service that we want, our clients want, and you want to provide. Say no, there'll be more for next year. And these are the discussions that we have on a fairly regular basis, and it's hard. And I appreciate it from their point of view. And sometimes it just comes up a little bit unexpected. Hotels just don't know what they're doing, and suddenly they find, maybe they've always overbooked by a few rooms and it's always panned out, and suddenly they're finding now they've overbooked by a few rooms and it's not panning out. No one's cancelling. They're all taking them up, and we're having to deal with that situation on a fairly regular basis. So yeah, that does happen when countries suddenly start trending.
Yeah. And what comes up is that ability to say no. That's actually come up in a few conversations I've had today. And just that, because I can appreciate they're like, we've got a great partner that has sent us a lot of business. They've been sending us a lot of business. We don't want to disappoint them, because the minute we say, no, we can't do it,
yep,
they're going to go find somebody else that can, and they're going to lose that business. They're not just, and it's like, they'd rather just take a little bit of a crapshoot and hopefully they can figure it out along the way. But yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, and then also just the attitudes of the people living in some of these communities. I mean, I think we all get to be sensitive to that, because if you're a tour guide or you own a hotel or you own a restaurant, you might be pretty excited about having a lot of tourists show up all of a sudden. But if you are a carpenter, a dentist, something else in the community, and all of a sudden, your neighbors are renting out their Airbnbs or their places for Airbnb. So you've got people that you're not comfortable with in the neighborhood constantly coming and going. You've got illicit activities that sometimes pop up in some of these places. I get that. I'm in Colombia. I see it. And I just heard recently, I saw something where, there's some protesting, and there's been protesting in a lot of places, but specifically in Spain was this article I had read about people that just like, okay, tourists go home.
Yep.
And so we all kind of have some responsibility to try, and whether our partners in Spain want us to slow down the business, I think we all kind of have a responsibility to kind of figure out how do we do this in a way that's sustainable, because, and it's not good for our clients. If we send our clients to Spain and people are throwing water balloons at them, telling them to go home, that's not going to be a good experience either. So it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah. And I think this is where I suppose in my years of being in travel, I've always tried to do good business, where for me, it's not about, I'm come from the rich Western country and I've got, money and clients to give you. It's very much a tit for tat service, which is, okay, yes, I have got some clients. They want to eat. You've got food. Can we do something that is beneficial for me and for you? And I suppose a couple of instances come to mind. One was, this was when I was tour leading. I was leading a trip in Ethiopia, which is a country which is going through some issues at the moment, unfortunately, but absolutely one of my favorite destinations. Northern Ethiopia is one of the most beautiful, mesmerizing places that I've been to, incredibly poor. And one of the highlights, which was a real highlight, there were some waterfalls outside of a town called Bahadar, called Tisisat Waterfalls. And they're about 400 meters wide, and beautiful. We'd used to do a really nice walk where you'd go from the plateau, you'd walk down and you'd get these full views, but it was a little bit rocky, and there would always be about 10 to 15 children, there to greet the buses, and they would try and grab, the hands of clients, assist them down, and then demand, a tip.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this used to stress clients out, because sometimes they'd be so busy trying to say, look, just let me walk, that they'd actually trip up in response. So I tried something one time, and we arrived in the bus, and I asked the group just to stay on the bus, and I called all the kids together, and they spoke enough English to understand. And I just said, okay, you are all providing a service. I said, your service is you're going to assist and guide people through this walk. I said, that's great. I said, and anyone that takes your service absolutely should pay for that service. I said, but not everyone wants it. And I said, I don't want you. You are not a beggar. You are someone who's providing a service. I said, so when my group come off, I said, there are some people, I've already spoken to them, they will require some assistance, but I want you to organize yourselves and to work out who is going to guide those people, and those people that don't want to be guided, you leave them alone, and I'll make sure that you get paid well. But I want the others left alone. And at first they were a little bit shocked, but they had a bit of a discussion. And from that time onwards, I used to go back every 2 weeks. They'd see me arrive and they'd get into their, they'd work it out in turns, and it worked. I mean, look, it didn't dramatically change the country, but I learned something from that, which is, if you treat people like beggars and like poor people that are an annoyance and that are just, getting in your way, they'll probably act the same way. And maybe they'll even feel the same way within themselves. Mm-hmm. But if you actually treat someone as a service provider whose time you respect, they'll probably show you the same respect in return. And I've tried that on quite a few occasions. And 9 times out of 10, it works and people respond very well to it. So that, I think, goes along with that if people don't want you there, you need to listen to them. And maybe you can find a compromise as to why they don't want you there. And is there a way forward rather than either just completely abandoning them, which in the long scale may not help anyone, or bouldering in regardless because you've got people wanting to go there. So it is a delicate balance and it needs to be, I think, sensitive to both sides.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that those are some really good points. It's, I think it's a big part of it is when the locals don't feel respected.
Yeah.
And I think that when they feel that, these foreigners are coming in and, maybe, increasing traffic, electricity issues, water issues, all these things, and then they don't feel respected. It's like, well, screw you. You guys need to get out of here. Maybe, if you're coming in using up some of these resources and you're saying, hey, we realize that we're using up some of these resources and we respect you and we want to work with you to figure out solutions, then the protest may go away. It's like, I think people just want to be respected in life and everything, not just tourism.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I have had that there are interesting, and especially you being in Latin America, there are some cultural differences which sometimes put that to the test. And I remember being with a group in Bolivia and the bus broke down. We're in a town and the driver said to me, he said, okay, I'm going to get it fixed. I'll be back in half an hour. Okay. So I said to the group, fine, go off, get a coffee, be back here in half an hour. I came back in half an hour, no driver, nothing. Waiting, another 15 minutes went by, nothing. Another half an hour went by, nothing. I said to the group, okay, look, it's lunchtime now. Go get some lunch. I'll see if I can locate the driver. I eventually found him. He was only 2-3 minutes away. And I said to him, we've been waiting by the side of the road. And he said, it's taking longer to fix. And he just said, you're trying to impose your hora inglés, your English time here. And I was just like, I said, I'm not. I said, I understand. I've been in Bolivia for long enough to know there are limitations, but I'm sorry. It's not showing respect to the clients to leave them stood by the road in ignorance for potentially 2-3 hours. You could have literally come back and told, again, before the days of mobile phones, you could have just told me it's taking a lot longer and worked with me. And we had a little bit of a clash over that. And that occasionally manifests itself. So the respect does need to work both ways.
Yes. No. Yeah. You're absolutely right. So, great stories. So I want to make sure we didn't miss anything in kind of your journey because you were doing the tour guide thing for Explore Worldwide.
I went to Explore Worldwide. I started leading for them and I was leading back-to-back trips and I was away 10, 11 months a year. I'd do 6 months in Turkey. I'd come back, see friends and family for 3-4 weeks. Then I'd be again away for 6 months. I led predominantly in the Middle East. So I went to Jordan. I went to Oman. I then went out to India, China, Pakistan. And I did that solidly for 2 years. And then what happened is what I was told would happen by the MD at the time of the CEO of Explore at the time. He said, after 2 years, you'll get a little bit bored. He said, you will think that there's nothing more to do. You've got the job down pat and you'll have a little bit of a crisis. He said, before you hand your notice in, come and have a chat with me. And so I did. And I said, I've reached that stage. And he asked me what types of trips that I'd done. And I told him. And he said, right, I think you need a new challenge. He said, you've been doing Middle East, Asia. He said, why don't you go and lead in Latin America? I said, I'd like to. I said, but I don't speak Spanish. And he looked at me and he said, we'll go and learn. And again, it was one of those revelations that just hadn't occurred to me. In my mind, I was someone that didn't speak Spanish, so I couldn't lead trips in Latin America. And I thought about it. I was like, yeah, why don't I? So I went to Spain. I did a crash course in Spanish for a month, came back, had an interview in Spanish. They went, yeah, you'll do. And they sent me off. And my first trip leading in Latin America was in Nicaragua. This would have been 1990. Oh no, would have been about the year 2000, perhaps. and I had no guide, and it was chaos. And thank God I had an American couple on my first trip who spoke fluent Spanish. And I love the story they told me. The reason why the guy spoke Spanish is his dad had been in the military. And during the Second World War, there had been rumors that the Japanese were going to invade the US through Mexico. So his dad had been posted to Baja California in anticipation of a Japanese invasion via Baja California, which never happened. So he grew up as a kid in Baja California, having a lovely life. So he spoke fluent Spanish, and he, together with his wife, helped me through that first trip. And once I got through that first trip, I suddenly had the confidence to know I can do this. So yeah, I led Nicaragua, I led Costa Rica, I led in Cuba, Argentina, Chile, all over. And so I spent the next kind of 2 to 3 years all in Latin America. And then I think after that time, I then asked to explore for the odd countries. So then I got given, Iran, North Korea, Mongolia, all the kind of the more challenging ones. But the ones then that really started to appeal to me, the ones that would appeal to people who've done quite a lot of travel and now want something different. So I did that solidly as a tour leader for 8 years. And I came to the conclusion that I loved the job and I could have continued doing that job probably forever. But I thought, I don't want to be doing this job probably when I'm in my 50s, the age that I'm at now. So I thought at some stage I'm going to have to stop. And the longer I leave it, the harder it's going to be. So I decided to ask Explore whether there was a job that they could offer me in head office. So I did. I became an operations manager. I did that for 2 years. And then it was being an operations manager at Explore. And at the time, I thought Explore were offering the wildest, the wackiest trips out there. And I absolutely loved it. That I came into contact with Jonny Bilby, who's the current CEO of Wild Frontiers. And our connection came because we had a mutual acquaintance who'd actually been on a Wild Frontiers trip. And she said, I'm going to a talk by this guy, Jonny Bilby. He's talking about tourism in Afghanistan. I was like, Afghanistan? So I've been to some places, but Afghanistan. So I was intrigued. So I went along to hear Jonny talk about Afghanistan. 50, 60 people. It was a small little talk. And I went up to him afterwards. And when he found out that I was working for Explore, he thought that I'd gone there as kind of the competition and that I was checking him out. And I was like, no, I said, literally just come as an individual, genuinely fascinated by the fact that you've been running trips in Afghanistan. And we started to chat a little bit. And then a few months later, we bumped into each other at the World Travel Market, big trade show in London, because we happened, while Frontiers and Explore shared the same local supplier in Ethiopia. And again, we acknowledged each other. And then we exchanged email addresses. We started talking about some challenges that we were both having with the Omo Valley region of Ethiopia that was suffering exactly the types of things that we're seeing now in Barcelona, with local people saying, we don't want you to come, or the whole experience. So we started really just discussing ways in which maybe together we could put pressure on our local partner to bring about a better outcome. And he invited me out for a drink to discuss that in more detail. And after about 5 or 10 minutes of me going on about the Omo Valley, he went, actually, Mark, he goes, I'm not really that interested in the Omo Valley. He said, fancy a job. And that is how it happened. And it happened just at the time that I think Explore was starting to rein in some of their more adventurous stuff. They were developing their family brochure. They were developing some of their UK travel and some of their more, I suppose, Western Europe cycling products, which was all good, but it interested me less than some of the more outlandish stuff. And here was someone offering trips to Afghanistan. And I felt that, this was the time for me to make the move. So I did. And that has been the journey that I've been on really for the last 15, 16 years, being with Wild Frontiers, starting off in operations, moving into product. We've gone from a company where I was employee number 11, and now we're up to about 40. And it's been incredible.
And you're not bored.
Jonny's still around. I'm still there. And it's going well.
Okay. Very, very cool. I've got a couple questions for you.
Sure.
I know there's many more that I should have asked, but I've got a couple that I want to make sure I ask. And one is, so go back to the beginning of the conversation, your mother and your father, who both kind of had this mindset, and probably more your family, kind of a generational mindset of travel is, a waste of money. It's or not a good use of money, especially when you have limited resources. So I'm sure that they already had some attitudes that conflicted with the conversation we're having. So what were their thoughts when you started doing this full time and were traveling the world leading group trips? Were they excited, supported? Did they think that was kind of frivolous, like some people think music and theater is when their kid says that's what they want to do?
That's a really good question. I have to say, I was so lucky that neither of my parents went to university. So I think by that point, I was already beyond their realm of experience. And they genuinely had this view, which is, we want you to be happy. And I think my dad said probably one of the nicest things to me when I was about 2-3 years into the trip, which was, if I was your age, I can't think of a better job that I would have wanted to have been doing now.
Wow.
So I've never had any of that pressure coming from my parents to get a proper job, which has been
be a lawyer,
I'm sure behind the scenes they were maybe a bit concerned. And it was very interesting was I ended up with Wild Frontiers going to Afghanistan a couple of times. And I told my parents that I was going to Afghanistan. I sat them down with a map and I explained to them why we were going, how we were going, how we were, going to do our very best to ensure security and all of those things, because I wanted them on board. And of course they worried, but they were okay with it. I had people on my trip in their 60s and in their early 70s who hadn't told their parents that they were going to Afghanistan. So everyone has a different way of dealing, with risk and of dealing with these things. But no, generally my parents have been very, very supportive of, of the life that I've chosen.
I'm happy I asked, because I could imagine a scenario where, okay, I'm going to go to a great school, presumably, took some resources, family resources to make it happen. I don't know, but I'm going to be a lawyer. And now you're leading trips, in these random places that they've never heard of when they, weren't adventurous themselves early on. So that's cool. I'm happy to know that. And the other question I want to ask is the American couple that joined you in Nicaragua. So was it clear to them? I'm imagining this scenario. It's like, you don't speak Spanish. You're their tour guide. They're their trip leader.
Yep.
And I'm guessing, and it's your first trip to Latin America, so I'm guessing some sort of conversation. Was this hey, this is my first time here and I don't speak Spanish?
Yep.
Or was it like, I'm still working on my Spanish. I'm just a slow learner.
I think it's always, because I led trips up Kilimanjaro, and you're always going to do a trip the first time.
Yeah.
You can't avoid it. There will always be a first time. And there is this dilemma. Do you tell people it's your first time, or do you try and blag your way through it? And I generally came to the conclusion that a lot of travel, people are putting a lot of trust in you. And I thought that if you get caught out being untruthful with people, then what are they going to believe? There might be a serious situation later on where they don't believe you. So I was always very honest with people. I'd play on the experience, which is I've been leading for 2, 3, 4 years. I've led X amount of trips. I know my job. This is my first time here. I've been here for a while. We've got local partners. I've got incredible notes, and I work really hard to make your experience, but work with me. And generally people were very accommodating. And I said this couple were very, very nice to me.
Okay.
So that's generally my approach. I'm not going to try. It's too easy to get caught out. It's too easy to get caught out. So no, I would never try and blag my way through. I'd be honest.
I've always kind of felt similar. You're right. You're always, anytime you go somewhere, it's going to be the first time you're there. Anytime you lead a trip, there's going to be a first time. And I remember my very first guide trip of any sort. I was working in a fly shop in Montana, and last minute, because I had a drift boat, I had a guide license, but I'd never guided a trip. And one of the guides didn't show up that day. And my boss was like, hey, instead of working in the shop today, you want to take these people fishing? I'm like, oh, geez. So I did. Super scared, super nervous. I'd fished the river many times by myself and with friends and other guys from the shop. And we got up, put the boat in the river, and then promptly forgot to leave my keys in the gas cap of the car, so they couldn't move the car down for me. but I was oblivious, and we went and had a fun day, and the rest of the world conspired to get a spare key from my ex-wife and get it, whatever. So the car got there. And at the end of the day, they never once asked, is this your first day? I had already decided if it comes up, I'm going to be honest.
Yeah. I think
But I'm not like, oh boy, I'm so excited. You guys are my first clients. Because you're on the river, there's moving parts, and it's like, we got to the end of the day, and I dropped them off at their car, and they said, wow, we've never been on a guide trip. This was really amazing. You really set the bar high. And it took everything I had not to say, what? I've never been on a guide trip either. I had never even been a client on a guide trip.
Right.
So it felt good. It was good for the confidence builder. I'm like, if this is my first one and it wasn't a total train wreck, it's probably good they hadn't been on guide trips before, because, maybe their bar or whatever, but it's a lot of good memories, and people are great. It's just so much fun to share things like that.
I was also, I think, taught not to be intimidated if there's someone on your trip who has better knowledge of some aspect of the country than you. I've had people who are incredible bird watchers. I've had other people who are, farmers, and they've got incredible knowledge of the agricultural fields that we're going through. Some people who know architecture. It's not a competition. You don't have to be the master of everything. If you can use that, remember it, then when you get your next group, you can take some of that knowledge and share it and pass it on. And it can be a really nice experience. And I think, Wild Frontiers now, we do, probably about 60% of what we do is still small group tours, which is what I was used to from my days at Explore. We also do a lot of tailor-made. But I think outside of just the incredible interactions with local people and the experiences, there are your fellow travelers. And I think some of my best memories are just some of the experiences that I had with fellow travelers. And there's just this one story which always comes to mind. And I was leading a trip in Cuba, and there'd been 3 people. It'd been a couple and then their neighbor. And they came from the north of England, and the neighbor was German, and they were very quiet, very nice, but in a very English kind of Germanic way, just very kind, and sat at the end of the table. And we were about a week through the trip, and I sat opposite them over lunchtime, and we'd just been talking about Castro and how he'd spent, I think it was 18 months in prison before the revolution. And the German lady was sat there, and she said, "Oh, Mark, very interesting what you were saying about Castro, that he spent 18 months in prison eating her food. Same as me." I said, "Sorry?" Oh. And she said, "Oh, yeah, I spent 18 months in prison." She said, she says, "I was in Berlin." She says, "I was caught tunneling under the Berlin Wall." She said, "I was arrested." She said, "And eventually I was exchanged in a prisoner swap. And that's how I ended up coming to England and, living next to these neighbors now." She said, but interesting times, and went back to her, her rice and beans. And I never in a million years would have got that from even the week that I'd spent with her. So I think I've gained as much from my travel experiences from just interacting with people who probably under any other circumstance I never would have met. And just having the time to hear their stories, which can complement and enrich, I think, the whole journey.
And if you're the type that's all about, I'm here to share my information, my knowledge, guide, and not show the curiosity in the people you're with, you miss so many opportunities. Like you were just saying, it's not about what can I show you. It's about, what can we experience together? You mentioned that story, and I had a client that on a trip to the Bahamas, and she had been, I don't remember the term for it, but she was a Cuban woman who'd been sent as a young child, shipped off as a young child to go live with people she didn't know in the States while her parents stayed in Cuba. And, so interesting experiences, and just having these conversations with, so many people that I've met, I know that you've met, that are, quite frankly, honestly, the conversations, what I got out of them, I think was a lot more interesting than what I gave them, to be honest with you. But that's okay. I'm selfish in that way. I'm not afraid to learn, and I'm not afraid to ask dumb questions, and cause I just want to absorb things, and it makes for fun. And I think people join a group trip because they want to engage, they want to exchange, they want to share. And I think that anybody in a group that wants to share their knowledge of ornithology, birds or something, is probably happy to do it. And they're probably don't care if they know more than the guide. It's like, they probably honestly feel kind of flattered and a little bit proud if the guide handles it right. So anyway, so many great stories. Marc, is there anything that I forgot to ask you, should have asked you, or anything that you want to make sure our listeners hear before we wrap it up?
Not really. I think I just want to leave you with one thing that really sticks in my mind, which for me sums up, I suppose, just the power that travel can have, and that it's not, as we've said, it's not restricted to you and the individual that you're interacting with. There's the other people in the group. But for me, one of the things that I found, and I think it's probably one of my proudest moments, is how it can impact friends and family back home. And I think for that, I'll tell you just very briefly the story of when I was in Iran. And a couple of things really struck me with Iran. The first was arriving at Tehran airport. And you go to a lot of airports all crazy and people are trying to grab your bags and everything. And there was a sign at Tehran airport that said, if you want a trolley, it's going to cost you 20 rials. However, if you're a foreigner and you've only just arrived in Iran and you haven't yet had time to change up your money into local currency, please take one for free. Welcome to Iran.
Oh, wow.
That was a nice welcome. And then I think I was in Isfahan on that trip, and I had two gay American New Yorkers, very thick accents, and we were chatting to some locals, and after a while they said, we're American, don't you? And the Iranian looked at him and said, yeah, I know you're American, you've got very thick accents. And he said, is that a problem? And the Iranian looked at him and said, why on earth would that be a problem? He said, oh, don't get me wrong. He said, I'm no fan of American foreign policy. He said, but I'm no fan of my own government's foreign policy. He said, but why on earth would I judge you according to the actions of your government? And then almost with a look of horror, he went, oh, please don't tell me you're judging me according to the actions of my crazy government. That story stuck with me. I told my parents that story. And then one day I was at my parents' place and I heard my mum on the phone telling that story. She didn't know I was there. She was telling the story to one of her friends and going, no. And I was quite surprised by that. And I suddenly felt these things, they have a life outside of the experience. And I think if you have a good experience, share it with people that trust you. They will then share it with people that trust them. And you can give really a much more extended life to people who will never get there, but the stories and the experiences that you've had, and the importance of reminding people of the fact that, we share much more in common than we have as differences, I think is a message which, especially in this day and age, is one that cannot be repeated often enough.
Wow. You just, that was the whole concept of this podcast, is that right there, what you just said. You just summarized the whole big world made small is, let's bring us together by having these conversations. And right now I feel incredibly proud for doing this because I got you to share that story. So if one person listens to that story, I mean, then that's great because you've had other people already listen to it. So thanks for sharing it here. No, beautiful, Marc.
Thank you for inviting me. This is a great thing which you're doing, and I wish you lots of success with it moving forward.
No, thank you so much. I look forward to collaborating on some projects with you in the future, and
sounds good.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Marc.
You too.
I trust you enjoyed listening to the conversation as much as I enjoyed recording it. If you're enjoying the Big World Made Small podcast, please take a moment to tell the algorithm by subscribing and posting a review so that others can benefit as well. I also invite you to take a quick trip over to bigworldmadesmall.com and join our private adventure travel community to receive new episode notifications, special access to our guest experts, and perhaps even some exclusive partner offers that we haven't discussed on the podcast. I'll publish another episode soon. Until then, keep exploring. It's the best way to make a big world feel just a bit smaller.